key program elements. It allows us to customize key program elements that align with our state specific needs. But, and this is a big but, decisions regarding the allocation and use of these funds for health and safety, as well as LIHEAP transfer funds, these are shaped through the state planning process with input from weatherization subgrantees. So this input is super critical in generating the best outcomes in the communities you and we are woven into and know best through the weatherization program. These state level processes, they influence broader policy, procedures that directly affect things like average cost per unit, strategies and savings to investment ratio or SIR, benchmarks. It also impacts workforce compensation structures. DOE does give us opportunities to innovate, to be more competitive, and to generate solutions. So let's get tuned in to what we can do to start that journey. In order to hit the units, we cannot do it alone. We need to effectively be able to communicate with our state partners and be very involved in the state planning process so that they know what we need in our plan, in the plan, in order to deliver and spend these precious resources to help stabilize low-income families, lower the cost burdens, and make homes more energy efficient. So I want to thank CAPLAW a ton for making this time for us to think, to explore, and talk about new opportunities and options that are available to us to initiate change and progress in weatherization. Before I turn it over, though, we're going to lean in, next slide, lean into the spirit of what we do and why we do it, live into the promise. Community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. Thank you again. At this time, I will turn it over to Jonathan and Allison. Thank you.
Thank you, Mia. It's great to be here to talk about these issues and present some information about the weatherization legal framework as it really relates to workforce development and some strategies around the ACPU and around incentive compensation that can be used to hopefully retain, recruit, and keep workers working in this program at your organizations. As Mia said, I'm John Cohen. I'm program lead and staff attorney here at CAPLAW. I'm joined by Allison Maloof, who's executive director here, who may pop in from time to time during the course of this presentation. But just a really brief overview, CAPLAW, for those who don't know, is an organization. We're based in the Boston area and really provide legal services, legal information, publications, resources, and training to the Community Action Network. And so we do that through individual consultations with organizations around legal issues. Pick up the phone, send us an email, let us know what your questions are, and you can get on the phone with one of our attorneys. We do that through resources and publications that we develop and release to the network, and hopefully you've seen our resources library on our webpage where all of our information lives. So there's a plug for that. If you haven't seen it, go see that at caplaw.org/resources. And then we do that through trainings, trainings like the ones you'll see today, where we have webinars, we speak in person, we speak virtually. And so that's what we're going to go through today, really. And so that's CAPLAW, a small team, but hopefully providing the network with needed resources and consultation. And today we're really going to talk again about legal frameworks. We're talk about workforce development, an issue I think that everyone has grappled with at community action agencies, certainly that we've heard in the network. This issue of how are we going to get qualified staff members, keep them on board, and retain them to do the great work that all of you are doing out there. And so we're going to talk about strategies for doing that today. Next slide, please. So here's basically our agenda that we'll be looking at, just overall workforce development, and we're going to really hone in on incentive compensation and the rules around that and the legal framework within which you can think about providing incentive compensation to staff and how you would go about doing that and what are the things you want to watch out for and how you can use federal funds to do that. And then specific to weatherization, we'll be talking about ACPU strategies and some potential flexibilities to use weatherization funds for that type of thing, for providing it to staff to retain, recruit staff members at your organizations. Next slide, please. And so let's just jump right in really to this issue of workforce development. You'll see here this information has been taken directly from Weatherization Program Notice 25-1, which is the most recent program notice for the program. Similar to language that's been used at least last year as well. With regard to workforce development, and what it says is essentially weatherization programs can attract a diverse, quality, and well-trained network, building the clean energy workforce. And DOE is going to support the state's efforts by doing those things that are listed there. So providing TNTA allocations for development activities, encouraging the development of comprehensive and need-specific training plans, that include the use of things like workforce partners, unions, community colleges, supportive services, apprenticeships, labor management partnerships, training programs. So a whole host of potential ways to go about building and developing those comprehensive programs to train high quality staff and people to perform this work. And then strongly encouraging braiding other resources to increase deployment of new technologies and to expand and enhance workforce skills. And so that's, sort of the guidance that's offered in the program notice about workforce development and really encouraging organizations to go about and think creatively about doing this. And we're going to focus on specific areas now, but just wanted to provide that, this is in WPN 25-1, so keep that in mind for context. Next slide, please. So in talking about the issues that we're going to talk about today, I really like to start with providing some context. This hypothetical is probably not a hypothetical for many of you who are on the call and for your organizations, just given the issues that we know are out there with programs. But just taking a look at this is called Keeping Casey. A number of weatherization employees have recently left your organization. Your organization is worried about having enough staff to meet the demand for weatherization services this fall. You have Casey, who's managed the weatherization team at your organization for 3 years. So certainly there's a need, a desire for your organization, your program to keep Casey, who's in a management position at the organization, has experience managing weatherization teams. You've had some recent loss of staff at your organization. And so front and center of your organization as sort of the fall is approaching is what can you do to get Casey to stay with the agency? I didn't mention this, but please type anything into the chat at any time for questions that you might have, but also if you have thoughts about this particular hypothetical, what can an organization do in this situation to get Casey to stay with the agency, especially at this crucial time in which the fall is approaching. There's probably a lot of work to be done, and you want to have Casey in place at the organization to provide those services. So anyone have any thoughts they wanted to type into the chat to sort of get us started on this? The slides, I believe, will be shared as well. So that was one of the questions I see there, but just know that. So keeping Casey, what can your organization do? What can you think about? I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but typical things that we've heard before that organizations are contemplating with regard to this, providing additional training, better equipping Casey to perform his role at the organization and feel prepared to do so in this situation, communicating about the potential challenges as well that the organization appears to be having with staffing can be another approach to really being open and transparent about what's going on so that Casey doesn't feel like no one's paying attention or that no one recognizes what's going on with the program. Raising, the key that we're going to be talking about here is another thing is really raising compensation for Casey. And there can be creative ways to do this. I think raising salaries, is sometimes something that we hear about with regard to this. I think that can be challenging just because salaries are more of a permanent increase. And so there could be worries there about whether or not there's the funding moving forward to continue to do that. There could be concerns with regard to if you're raising Casey's salary, what about others at the organization? Is there funding available to do that? Does that make sense? Are there going to be, if you raise Casey's salary, are there going to be complaints about, well, why is Casey getting an increase in salary when the other staff of the organization are working just as hard and not seeing it? And so those are some of the concerns. Um, I'm seeing someone write in, thank Casey for his years of service and acknowledge his role as a key contributor. Certainly, celebrating Casey as an employee of the organization and what he's brought to the organization, and being open and forthright about that, both to Casey, but also celebrating some wins possibly that Casey has achieved for the organization, can be key to boosting morale and things like that. On the compensation piece, on paying Casey more, this idea of paying Casey more, or creating the opportunity for Casey to earn more income, one option that we're really going to focus on is incentive compensation. So this idea of, this is, capitalism that at work here that we're talking about. We're in a position where we want Casey to do something. We want Casey to stay through at least through the fall season. We really value what Casey brings. So how can we encourage Casey to do this? Well, pay Casey more money in the form of incentive compensation, incentivize some type of performance or some kind of outcome that you as an organization would like to see. In this case, Casey remaining with the organization. And so with incentive compensation comes a bunch of rules that we're going to walk through when you're thinking about this at your organization. If this is something I know a lot of organizations have thought through, but if this is something that you would think through at your organization about how to go about doing this, these are the rules that you'd want to think about with regard to incentive compensation to keep Casey, to retain Casey, or staff in similar positions at your organizations in the weatherization program or even other programs. And where we're going to start really, where where many nonprofits might start with a lot of rules is the IRS, so the Internal Revenue Service. We start here because most community action agencies are private, nonprofit, 501c3 organizations. This means that they're tax exempt under the IRS rules, so don't have to pay income taxes and things like that. And the reason for this is because those organizations have been recognized as tax exempt because they have some type of charitable purpose. And so the mission of the organization, the whole purpose of the organization being is to achieve some type of charitable purpose. And so the IRS, the government has determined those types of organizations, because they're achieving some kind of charitable purpose, some type of larger mission for the public good, don't have to pay taxes. And so thinking about this, we have to think about this from the IRS perspective, because no part of the total earnings of that organization may flow to the benefit of any private individual. This is also called private inurement in the nonprofit context. So no assets, no funds of the private nonprofit organization can privately benefit anyone at the organization. So executive director, board of directors cannot be privately inured by any of the funding that they're getting. These organizations do not exist to privately benefit any of those individuals. They're not, for example, shareholders of the organizations. They are staff and board members, and so those funds can't go to them for their private benefit. They have to go towards the organization's charitable purpose. And so why do we really care about this? Well, as I mentioned, these are rules under the IRS. And so there could be pretty stiff penalties if these rules are violated. So if, for example, an organization is shown to have done something or engaged in a transaction that results in excessive private benefit for, let's say, a board member or the executive director or a staff member even, then that organization certainly can face potential monetary fines as a result of that action and taxes on that. But also, if it's something that goes uncorrected, if it's something that is deemed serious enough, the organization can also lose its tax exempt status, which for organizations like CAs, you can probably tell how that could be a pretty big problem to have. So pretty serious consequences there for violating these rules. Um, I should also say not just that, but the individuals who made those decisions, which resulted in that private benefit or that private inurement, can face individual financial consequences as well. So not just the organization is at risk here, but the individuals, let's say the board members who voted to privately benefit or privately inure someone or privately enrich someone, can face monetary penalties as well. So hopefully that has scared you enough to pay attention and not engage in any type of private inurement at your organizations, which I'm sure you all were not doing anyway. So what would the IRS come in and look at if they were to say, well, we think there's been private inurement here. We think, there's really excessive bonuses, for example, that an executive director is getting, hundreds of thousands of dollars out of. They're going to take a look at multiple factors to determine whether or not a bonus or incentive compensation rises to the level of private inurement, whereby these penalties would be in play. One of them is the total compensation reasonable? We'll talk about reasonability at multiple points in this presentation, but things like what to other, let's say it's taking the executive director example, what to other executive directors in the geographic area at similar sized organizations, what do they tend to earn compensation wise, total compensation wise, and how does the bonus fit into that? Does this bonus seem on par with that, or within within a reasonable scope of what we tend to see, or is it really far outside the bounds of that? Something else that can speak to reasonability in this context is when you've drafted your incentive compensation policy, has there been a ceiling that you've placed, let's say, on the total amount that can be earned by someone, or is it basically unlimited? So there's a ceiling in place, can be an indication that you had reasonability of how much can be earned through incentive compensation in mind when you were doing this. And so some organizations will put a ceiling in place for that reason. I'll also look to, does the organization have a conflict of interest policy? And this is one of those key internal controls. Community action agencies should have them in place per the organizational standards. Those should be there. But those conflicts of interest policies will really talk about how interested, let's say, directors or interested officers of the organization who have a financial interest, let's say, or a personal interest in a particular decision can disclose that, accuse themselves from that decision, and have sort of arm's length from that type of decision, so that you can point to that and say, well, we as an organization really think about this. So we have this policy in place that its aim is to have an internal control over whether or not someone who's going to benefit from something can actually make a decision over it. Business purpose as well. Your incentive compensation policy, your incentive compensation plans that you have at your organizations should serve a business purpose. So in the context of, let's say, Casey, the business purpose is you want to retain key staff, key managers of your weatherization program, and you're trying to encourage that through incentivizing compensation in certain ways. And so that's the business purpose for that, is to make your programs work better, because the theory is Casey's a valued employee, and when Casey is there, the program is better able to serve clients, better able to weatherize homes because of that experience. And so that's the type of business purpose you want to be able to show. Services personally performed as well is another factor. You want to, it is a stronger case to make if you can show that this individual, this employee who received the incentive compensation actually achieved the benchmark or the thresholds that were in place to achieve it. Now, sometimes incentive compensation is written in such a way where teams can earn it. Well, that may be something that's allowable. Just be aware of this factor. You're always going to want to be able to show that even someone on a team personally earned this incentive compensation. They personally performed whatever it is they needed to do to do that. Let's say, their team weatherized a certain amount of homes to earn a particular incentive bonus. You want to show that this individual was on that job site, was in attendance at work for each of those times that counts towards that incentive bonus that they earned. So hopefully that's clear. This is really the IRS component of this, the 501c3 organization factors, rules that you'll need to keep in mind with regard to incentive compensation and offering it at your organizations. Next slide, please. Having said that, provided those are in place, a lot of organizations can say, well, these are reasonable plans that we have, and so that's an issue that they thought about and want to provide. But one of the key things that they have to think about, that everyone has to think about, is how are you going to pay for the incentive compensation that you want to provide to your employees, and that's certainly a key consideration and key issue here with regard to incentive compensation, because as federal grant recipients, it would be sure great if CAs could use federal funds to pay for the incentive compensation that they want to provide to their employees. And so let's talk now about how they would go about doing that, because lo and behold, the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for federal awards, or Uniform Guidance for short, does talk about incentive compensation and when it might be allowable. And so those are really the rules that we're going to go through now. Provided you've met the IRS requirements, how do you go about implementing plans and thinking about incentive compensation in such a way that will allow you to use your federal funds to provide and cover the costs of incentive compensation? And so you see here incentive compensation, the citation there to 2 CFR 200.430 subsection F, a very lawyerly citation that I'm sure you're all going to rush out and look up right now. But just know that's where what I'm going to be talking about over the next couple of slides is located. That's really the compensation section of the cost principles, which talks about what costs are allowable to federal awards. And so incentive pay, it's temporary, discretionary increase in pay. We're not talking about salary increases here. We're really talking about bonuses, temporary, discretionary. And the uniform guidance does talk about incentive compensation, and you see the language quoted there says incentive compensation to employees based on cost reduction or efficient performance, suggestion awards, safety awards is allowable if, and you see the factors there. So good news, the uniform guidance does essentially map out a way whereby federal funds can be used to cover incentive compensation for the reasons stated: cost reduction, efficient performance, suggestion towards safety awards. And then if, let's go through these one at a time, the overall compensation is reasonable. So there's that word, again, reasonable. In a couple slides, we'll really talk about this, but what we're talking about here is similar to what we saw with the IRS. We're talking about reasonability in terms of what do people in similar positions or programs or organizations receive in terms of compensation. Is this outside the bounds, or is it within really the scope of what you see there in the geographic area, et cetera? So thinking about compensation and reasonability in that sense will be key for cost allowability as well. Shouldn't be a surprise. Reasonability is one of those general factors for cost allowability to federal awards. So that's there. See there as well, pursuant to an agreement between the CAA and employees entered into before services were rendered. So that keyword there, before, is underlined and a different color because that's a really key piece here. When you think about, you're trying to, as an organization, incentivize something. So you're trying to incentivize, let's say, better performance or more better safety at your organizations or reductions in costs. It makes sense that in order to incentivize an employee to do something, they need to know about it beforehand. Otherwise, there's no incentive to do anything because you don't know about it. So, before services are rendered, so employees need to know before they do something that they have the chance to earn whatever the incentive compensation may be in order to do that. And so that's a key piece as well for cost allowability. And, we'll talk about how your written policy should go about doing this. And certainly having a policy in place will put employees on notice that there is the opportunity to earn this and incentivize them to do so. And then you see there, pursuant to an established plan, followed by a CAA so consistently as to imply, in effect, an agreement to make such payment. Now, the language you see there doesn't necessarily require a written policy be in place on incentive compensation for it to be an allowable cost to federal awards. There can be an established plan that your organization, let's say, has for the last 15 years provided employees who have had no safety awards, for example, on a job, or no safety incidents, for example, on a job site for the past year, some kind of bonus or incentive compensation, and that's a practice that they've had in place. If everybody knows about it, something they've done for years, then theoretically, um, then that could be something they could use their federal awards for. With that said, please do think about having a written policy in place. That is certainly the best practice with regard to incentive compensation. It's far easier to show a federal funder, hey, we have this policy in place, and here's the criteria and how we lay out the incentive compensation, versus the having an established plan that everyone knows about that may not be written down anywhere. And so keep that in mind as well. I will also say I'll be talking about this in the context of what's known as the Department of Health and Human Services Departmental Appeals Board, which is essentially the board or the appeals board at HHS that hears and decides upon appeals for cost disallowances. And so that's where a lot of this information that you're hearing about now and that you will hear about in the next couple slides comes from in terms of our interpretation of what might be an allowable cost, is the DAB has ruled on various things. And one of those decisions, just so you know, has talked about this issue of an established plan, and that it is possible, if you have that type of established plan, for these costs to be allowable. But again, it's always safer to have a written policy in place. Next slide, please. So I want to talk with that in mind, with the uniform guidance in mind, and also with some of those IRS requirements as well, because there is some crossover. What do you need to think about as an organization for the written policy that you are hopefully going to put in place if you are going to do this? Well, certainly you will want to make a connection to the uniform guidance. And so you saw on the previous slide this notion of incentive compensation being allowable for cost reduction, efficient performance, suggestion awards, safety awards. And so put that or something similar or something that falls under that scope in your policies when you're writing them, that that is the purpose of the policy, is to encourage, let's say, better performance, to encourage above average job performance, or encourage the organization to cut costs, or improve safety records, safety results of the organization. So have that in there so that anyone who looks at it knows that that's the purpose of it. And so that certainly awarding agencies know that the purpose of it falls in line with the uniform guidance and what's allowed as a cost to federal awards under the uniform guidance. So you'll see there this piece about not historically allowable. So in the past, the DAB has issued rulings a number of years ago, I'll say, where incentive compensation, so bonuses, things like that, the costs to federal awards were not allowable for purposes like job seniority, so length of time you've been there, length of service, or to make up for historically low salaries. And so hopefully none of you are panicking now, because when we started this conversation, we talked about Casey and the need to keep Casey on board with the organization. And some of you might have thought, well, let's reward him for his length of service, for example. Can you do that? Well, no, John, you just said DAB has said length of service, job seniority, not something we can think about here. But hold on, let's talk a little bit more about that, because that's really related to past DAB decisions, and there have been some developments in recent times related to this that may be encouraging. So the pandemic certainly changed a lot of people's thinking for some federal agencies on incentive compensation and when it might be allowable for some of these things. So let's talk about that now. Next slide. So as I mentioned, with regard to purpose, there's been a bit of a post-pandemic shift in certain federal programs on the thinking over this. I think many agencies, certainly many industries, have had some staffing concerns during and since the pandemic in terms of recruitment, retention of employees, how that's going to work. and sort of how they can encourage those things at their organizations, at their agencies. This is certainly something that's been recognized by the Head Start program, and so many of you might have Head Start programs at your organizations and might know about this. You'll see the citation to ACF information memorandum there from 2022, which essentially talks about this issue of how to encourage staff retention. And one of the things they talk about is using base Head Start funds to provide things like bonuses, so short-term pay increases, other financial incentives that can be used to recruit and retain qualified staff of the organization. And so job seniority in that IM, length of service, historically low compensation would be allowable purposes of Head Start funds in that context. So essentially, what we were just talking about with those prior past DAB decisions, Head Start is now saying, hey, I think it's a new world, and in this new world, these are the things we need to do to attract, retain qualified staff for our programs. And so these types of things are going to be allowable uses of funding moving forward. So that was Head Start. Not necessarily weatherization, but I raise this for a couple of reasons. One, um, in your conversations with your states, and we know this has happened in at least one state where this issue was raised with the state, saying, "Hey, can we use our weatherizations funds to provide incentive compensation to staff because we need to retain them. We need Casey to stay. We need qualified managers in place to do this work." And in that state, they worked with the state, and the state said, "Yeah, that makes sense. We're going to allow that." And so you can have this type of policy in place. And so when you take this information back to your organizations in the conversations that you're having with your state, I would encourage you, well, it is a Head Start program information memorandum. I think the arguments contained in there would be the similar ones that you'd want to raise with your states and say, hey, state, look at this. We need to it's a new world. We need to retain and attract qualified staff. We want to do an incentive program, incentive compensation program to do that. Head Start's doing it. Other funders are doing it. So can we do it in our state? And so hopefully that can provide guidance for how you would have that conversation, the arguments that you would make to really influence how your state is going to look at incentive compensation and allow it hopefully in the case of seniority, length of service, and maybe historically low compensation as well. Next slide, please. So getting a little bit more detailed about your written policy that I know you're all going to be working on now at your organizations. When you're thinking about the incentive criteria, how you're going to measure whether or not someone qualifies for incentive compensation at your organization, uh, you definitely want to be objective about it and realistic, and link it to accomplishment of your CA's exempt purpose. I think the exempt purpose, hopefully, is understandable now that you understand the IRS rules related to this. Again, incentive compensation is for ultimately your organization to better achieve its mission and better fulfill its charitable purpose, not for private enrichment or inurement. So link it to the accomplishment of that purpose, but be objective about it. You know, put benchmarks in place uh, that are measurable. So measurable objectives. For example, I think I used this example before, but let's say, for a year, anyone who is able to, or anyone who worked in the weatherization program on a job site and had no safety incidents, let's say, could earn incentive compensation. Or let's say anyone who worked on a certain number, an objective, a realistic number of weatherization job sites over the course of a year gets to earn a particular incentive compensation. And so that will be informed, of course, by the size of your programs and how many job sites typically someone works on, and where you want to get to as an organization and a program to incentivize that type of work, but leave it realistic and certainly keep it objective and measurable. What you're thinking about here as well is you don't want someone to you don't want someone's incentive to really be based on, let's say, a supervisor's assessment of something that they've done, because maybe they give it to one employee but not another. The employee who doesn't get it is certainly going to be wondering, well, why didn't I get it? Is it for some protected reason where I'm going to turn around and say, hey, I was, let's say, discriminated against for not getting this incentive compensation, whereas you gave it to Casey over here for getting it as well, and we basically performed the same job. So you want to try to eliminate those types of conversations if you can, and you could do that with objective criteria. Apply the criteria to individual employees. Touched on this before. You really want to be able to show that that individual employee did what they need to do, met that objective criteria and that benchmark themselves to earn the incentive compensation. That's certainly the safest way to go about that. Again, possible that this could happen in a team, but again, even in a team, be able to show that this employee was there and conducting the work and doing the work that earned them this incentive compensation. Next slide, please. So in your written policy, you want to be reasonable. There's that word again, be reasonable. Total compensation as well. You're looking at this holistically, not just necessarily the bonus, but this employee who's earning their compensation. Where does the bonus fit into it? Is that within the scope of what employees, similar organizations, similar jobs earn in this? And of course, consider those comparable workers and locations that are similar to yours as well. Have safeguards in place too. I would emphasize this for anyone putting these policies together. So certainly as a grant recipient, you have program goals and objectives under those awards that your program has to meet. And so you want to be sure that you are able to meet those program objectives and program goals. Um, Certainly in addition to providing your employees with incentive compensation, and hopefully those incentive compensation packages or policies that you're developing actually further meeting program goals and objectives. And so the notion is here, let's say you've put in place an incentive compensation plan and you're providing incentive compensation to people in your weatherization programs, but that's sort of taking funds away from actually some of the work that needs to be done and some of those goals and objectives that need to be met. Have a safeguard in place in your policy that says in those instances we really need to meet the goals and objectives first, and bonuses, incentives will be provided if there's sort of additional funding left over in that situation. Set a cap as well can be key on total incentive compensation for each employee. In some ways, this is funny because you're trying to protect against those really, really high overachievers. But this is really just designed um, to be reasonable, to have something in place to be able to show that. Remember, I mentioned the ceiling issue with the IRS rules, and to guard against what you see in that last bullet point, and in terms of are you forced to sort of pay an employee exorbitant amounts that's taking away really from the ultimate goals and mission of the organization and the program. So can be a good idea to set a cap on total incentive compensation in that context. And then the board should certainly have oversight over this and maybe reserve discretion for the board to cancel awards in certain circumstances if that's the case. And so consider that as well. Next slide, please. So just some things to keep in mind with regard to this. We've touched on some of these, but wanted to provide a quick refresher. Definitely get board approval for any type of incentive compensation policy that you put in place. Certainly within their role as fiduciaries of the organization, they want to make sure it's in the best interest of the organization. And so within that governance and oversight scope, get their approval. Charge it to the proper grant period, and that grant period should be the grant period in which incentive criteria is met. And so think about it, the work that a particular employee is doing is benefiting that particular grant period in which they've done it. And so your incentive criteria for that is tied to that period as well. And so that's when they should be charged. That's the grant period that should be charged for that. Apply it consistently. We alluded to this before. Don't be subjective about it. Don't make it overly complicated. Make it realistic, objective, relatively simple. Make it understandable so someone certainly knows if and when they might earn their incentive compensation. It's not something that's going to be very difficult to figure out. And then certainly follow your incentive criteria if that's the case. If someone did not meet the threshold or did not meet the criteria, then they essentially didn't earn the bonus, and don't get into things like making selective exceptions for various people, because that can lead to a whole host of problems. Call it as it is. If it's a bonus program, call it a bonus program. Whoever is going to be looking at this, if they're questioning it, is going to sort of read into what it is, and so you might as well call it what it is as well. Document, document, document. Very important to document the earning of the incentive. I think I used the safety example earlier, but let's say also if your incentive compensation plan notes that anyone who helps weatherize 5 homes earns the incentive compensation, then be able to document and show that that person was there at 5 homes so that they earn their incentive. And then there are reporting requirements on your IRS Form 990 related to bonuses and incentives provided. And so just remember to report that correctly there as well. Um, Next slide, please. So getting back to our hypothetical again, and please do type any thoughts into the chat on this. I'll also sort of talk through these answers as well. On this issue of can you pay Casey, remember Casey is that weatherization manager we really want to keep in place for the fall season. He's been here 3 years already. You certainly want to keep him for fourth and hopefully beyond if things keep going well. Can you pay Casey an additional $500 to stay for the fall season or stay through the fall season? Um, Anyone have any thoughts? Please type that into the chat. I will, in the interest of time, I'll sort of walk through it as well. Hopefully, as you're typing vigorously on your computers. So paying Casey an additional $500 to stay through the fall season. Well, this is an issue. You'll want to think about a few things. Is $500 a reasonable amount to have to incentivize someone to stay through that period? Looks like it could be reasonable, but you'll want to make sure and check with sort of the compensation figures available in your area. This is sort of a length of stay bonus or a length of stay incentive here as well, that, as you recall, in past DIB decisions has been not allowed, but in programs like Head Start and as I've said, we've seen movement in some in at least one state for weatherization programs. Could be possible that there's an evolution in thinking on this. So very possible that your weatherization authorities in your statement say, yeah, that makes sense, that you would allow this in the state to keep him on board as a qualified person. So it could be possible to pay Casey this. That's all to say that. But you'll want to make sure that before you do, there's a policy in place that says, let's say anyone staying through a particular season will get an additional $500 for doing so. That sort of can get to issues of, well, would one season make sense, for example? So that could raise other issues there as well. But in general, it could be allowable, is what I'll say there. How about if he refers a friend who is hired by your CAA? Could that be something that you pay Casey an additional $500 for? You know that Casey certainly knows, the organization knows that staffing has been a little difficult, and so maybe have some kind of policy in place that says if you as an employee refer someone to the organization who's recruited and eventually gets hired, maybe there's an additional bonus in it for you. Again, that's something that I think you can certainly make the argument for, something you could incentivize an employee to do to help sort of bolster the program. But again, make sure it's reasonable for that amount. Uh, Make sure that's in a written policy somewhere, or it's an established practice of the organization that anyone who does that who has done that over a certain amount of time consistently has received a bonus. So those are the things to think about there as well. Can you pay Casey an additional $500 on his 4th anniversary with the CAA? So another issue in terms of retention for a certain amount of time. Can you do that for Casey? Again, you're looking at, is that a written policy practice at the organization that they've done that? Has Casey known about that beforehand? I would say that, if Casey's 4th anniversary hits and you just give an extra $500, I would say that's probably not a way that you could use your federal funding to go about doing that, because there was nothing in place where Casey was motivated or incentivized to stay throughout that 4th year to say, hey, if I stay through my 4th anniversary, I get $500. Now, if you had a written policy in place, it's possible. But again, if you want to use weatherization funds to cover that additional $500, you'll need to have conversations with your state about that using those, let's say, Head Start arguments that we talked about. Next slide, please. So this is just an article that CAPLAW, we released an article on incentive compensation towards the end of 2019, which, as you now know from this presentation, was before some of this evolution in thinking about incentive compensation occurred, certainly in the Head Start program, and certainly before the pandemic. And so we revised that and updated it in August of 2024. And so basically, most of what I've talked about today is covered in this article. So if you have further questions about it, you wanted to see how we wrote about it in certain ways, please do check out this article that is on CAPLAW's website on these issues. Next slide, please. So wanted to talk briefly about average cost per dwelling unit and how there could be some flexibilities within that, within the weatherization program specifically in that context to sort of be able to find some additional funding to pay for some of these efforts that you might want to, let's say, provide incentive compensation with. As you all know, there is the ACPU to think about with regard to labor costs on weatherization efforts and programs. And so wanted to talk about some strategies there. And so really just starting with what has to go in the state plan, the requirements for grantees, which they must include there, the expected ACPU in the state, which takes into account total number of dwellings to weatherize, total amount of funds there as well that are expected to be applied. And so each state is going to come up in their state, put in their state plan the expected ACPU there within the state. And you see there, we'll talk about the amount of allowable direct program expenditures really quickly, as well as admin funds in a couple of slides later. But that's going to go in the state plan. Next slide, please. Just a side note, where could you always find the ACPU for a program year? Anyone wants to type it in the chat? In the interest of time, I will just give you the answer. It is the weatherization program notices, A there. So we can move on to the next slide really quickly there. This works a lot better in person. On the next slide, you're seeing there the ACPU, what it's currently at. So from program notice 25.1, you see there average expenditure for labor, weatherization materials, and other matters shall not exceed $8,547 per unit for weatherization, and then $4,302 per unit for a renewable energy system, which does count towards the overall limit. Both of those are adjusted annually. So take a look at the new WPNs. I'm sure you all know this. And then the issue with cost of vehicles and equipment as defined in the uniform guidance can amortize those over its useful life for determining unit cost limits. And I mention this in the context of this, as well as the slide on the state plan, because I think there could be some flexibilities here with regard to the ACPU sort of overall that a state's working with. So the state sort of puts in place their ACPU. However, not all organizations, not all subgrantees that are weatherizing homes are going to reach the limit for this ACPU, for example. And so with that in mind, it could be possible working with your state, and again, these are conversations to have with your state to see if they'll allow this type of flexibility, is to say, well, we may be going a little over on our ACPU limit that you've set here. But other organizations that have gone a little under. So together, you're still as a state meeting that sort of ACPU limit. But as an individual grantee, subgrantee, if you're going over, maybe that's allowable, and maybe the state's going to provide that flexibility because they know, based on their overall understanding about how the program's working in the state, that there is some room to do that because some subgrantees are falling under that number. And so that's just raise that as potential flexibility to have and conversations to have with your state about this particular issue with the ACPU. Next slide, please. Wanted to talk about another flexibility here as well, related to ACPU. Here are just what the federal regulations say must be included in the ACPU. So you see there materials, labor costs, and you see how labor costs are laid out there. Transportation of materials. Going to the next slide, it's just another few bullet points about these allowable expenditures, which you can all see in the citation there. In 440.18. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, that's just the rest of 1 through 9 there of things that must be there. I just raised that here because I'm going to talk about some things to think about there that you can sort of pull out of the ACPU calculation. The DOE has provided sort of optional flexibilities for, but just wanted to say here with administrative costs, just a true false. States have full discretion to determine the amount of administrative dollars they pass down to the subgrantees, i.e. the CAA. I see Mia shaking her head. No, I'm guessing that she's guessing false here. That is the correct answer. False is correct. If we move on to the next slide, I'll give you a little bit more information as to why. So up to 50% of the total state allocation may be used by state subgrantees for administrative purposes. So your administrative costs is at that 15% limit for the state and subgrantees. However, at least half of that has to be passed to the subgrantees. The state can't just decide we're going to take all that 15% to ourselves. They can't even say we're going to take 7.6%. They have to pass at least half of that to the subgrantees. Just note, threshold has been increased from 10% to 15% in the 2021 Appropriations Act. And I mention this because there could be some flexibility here to have conversations with your state about administrative expenses and what they're allowing in terms of subgrantees here as well. So what are they going to pass on to subgrantees? Are they just going to pass along 7.5% to the subgrantees, or can you have conversations with them to say, well, we've seen an uptick in administrative costs over this time related to, let's say, admin staff or whatever. We want to see if it's possible to see if we can increase that percentage that's coming to subgrantees. And so just another potential area where your organizations can have conversations with the state. Next slide. So I wanted to reference this just finally here, some more budget flexibilities that were recognized in program notice last year, 24-7, on costs that would fall outside the ACPU expenditures. And if you take a look at this program notice, you'll see that there are certain budget categories that the grantee or the state can decide, well, we want to take these budget categories out of the ACPU expenditure calculations and treat these separately, in which case, there could be, potentially more funding available within those expenditures that are there to, let's say, for example, increase salaries or provide incentive compensation. And so basically their DOE is saying it's allowable for grantees to pull out intake eligibility, final inspection, and energy audits and treat those separately as separate budget categories that would not go into the calculation of the ACPU. And so that could potentially free up more funds to charge to charge to these increases. And so within those budget categories, you can charge staff salary, fringe, and travel associated with each of those as well. So that is in addition to current optional categories that are in the regulations cited there for things like health and safety, financial audits, liability insurance, and leveraging that are optional categories and have been optional categories to be pulled out of the ACPU expenditure already. So there's just more flexibility there, I think, for programs to be able to pull those out. Again, if the state does that. So again, have those conversations with your state, talk about it with them, and try to get that flexibility included. Next slide. So that is the end of my presentation, our slides here at CAPLAW. Happy to take some questions. I think there were a couple that came in related to this, and so yeah, happy to do that now. I think looking back, it looks like Mia, you might have asked one.
I
Is the
did. I just wanted to first thank you because, like I said at the top of the hour, I couldn't be more excited about what was in this webinar. Because this is really conversation that is hard to have, I think, at the agency level, not always had, regularly, and difficult to broach. So taking these slides into your executive director's office and, setting up time and really letting them know that you've been doing a lot of thinking about this, tie it to Head Start. If you're a Head Start program, this doesn't happen overnight, but it really, again, there's a lot of potential here. So my question was, is the cap that DOE has put in place for incentives, is there any tie to the staff's annual salary? Is there a is there a dollar amount cap? You can't go over, I'm going to say $5,000 for the year. Or if someone's making $50,000 a year, the 5% of annual salary. Is there any guidance on that?
There's no real guidance on that. I think the cap is, I think this was in reference to what I said about when you're writing your policy, think about having a ceiling in place for any incentives that you're offering. And so that's not necessarily tied to a funding source requirement or anything like that. That's really tied to, is it reasonable? And so having a cap in place can help sort of keep it reasonable by providing that. It can also have a cap in place to make sure that that you're not getting obligated too much of your funds, sort of getting carried away with paying incentives when you have these other costs that you certainly, CAs aren't awash with funding, certainly to provide all this stuff, and so it can be a way to sort of control really costs and control how much is going to incentive compensation there as well. Just to sort of be thinking about that when you're devising your incentive compensation policies and plans. Have something in place that basically says, well, this is sort of getting out of control. In practice, you may be seeing that your employees are earning their incentives over and over again, and so that can cause problems down the road for organizations that are certainly limited with funding.
I do also want to acknowledge that, some organizations, may be reticent to, create disparity between departments. Weatherization is, allowed these incentives and other departments or other programs are not. And I guess what I would kind of lean in to say is, weatherization does allow them and enables them. And so kind of not tapping into that because organizations might be a little nervous about kind of upsetting the salary and grade chart in your organization, be really thinking about what that could be doing to prevent you from being competitive in the market and really looking out to what people are doing. So these guys are going to be with us at the end of January at MLTC in New Orleans, and registration is open. So I really want to encourage you guys, if you want to hear more like this, that you feel like empowered walking away from, this is the conference that you'll want to attend. I want to acknowledge Allison. To say,
Yeah.
a few words if you would like to before we close out today.
Yeah, I
Thank you,
just wanted,
Jonathan.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, I just wanted to just mention, and I might have missed it, John might have already talked about this, but I actually have handled a consultation with a CAA that had Head Start and weatherization, and they were actually trying to put an incentive compensation in place and focused on other funding that they didn't have explicit directives from the funding source with respect to the compensation. And so in that situation, the state had actually issued a memo to the community action agencies who were weatherization providers to say you can provide incentive compensations to your weatherization staff, and these are the bases which you could use, you know, for that incentive compensation. So I think sort of tagging on to John's message around speak with your state, you know, talk to your state. If for some reason there's some, you're feeling challenged or you're concerned, to Mia's point, you know, this is something that it sounds like DOE hasn't come out and said one way or the other with respect to they're not discouraging people from doing this or discouraging states from taking action here, which is fantastic. And we know that states are taking action in this area and are supporting their providers in this area. And so if you're feeling edgy or unsure about it, you know, reach out to your state and have these conversations, because there are other states that your state can talk to that are doing this. And I think have nice policies that honestly, the more funding sources we can get to come out and more directly follow that lead that John talked about that was established during the pandemic period, the better off we're going to be across the board, especially as community action agencies, since we do get funding from so many different sources.
You're here.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask us to kind of wrap it up. But what I will say is that questions that are here, we can reply back to you individually. Again, our STAR team from CAPLAW will be with us at MLTC, and we are putting together plans to keep them in the regular rotation here so that these types of things, these types of webinars, these types of, you know, again, empowering tools to take back to your states and to your agencies, you know, will be readily available to you. So thank you so much for being here, you guys. Have a really happy holiday. And with that, I think we'll close. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.